Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 8th of November, and today we're going to continue looking at very important developments, beginning with the Andriivka front and then moving to Kurakhove, Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar, northwards looking at Kursk. There are a lot of interesting developments from there that have only recently started to come out over the past few hours. So we're going to look at all of that today, in addition to reporting about the Ukrainians conducting reforms within their order of battle and some of their brigades. Also, the Russian forces moving around some units in the Kursk region. So we'll, of course, cover all of that today. Beginning with the Andriivka direction, as I now refer to it, because the Russians are about 12 kilometers away from the southern outskirts of the city itself. You can see the Russians continue to get additional control of fields between villages they've already gotten control over. So in this case, it's 7.9 square kilometers. These hinterlands, which are actually located on ridges. These ridges really run from the southeast to the northwest. In this case, running basically in between Rozliv and Rozdolnia over here. You can see it marked with this arrow on the map. These are important heights to get control over. First of all, in order to have an overlooking position onto Andriivka, also in order to get suitable conditions to overlook the entirety of Ukraine's positions running along the Mokryali River, running along the horizontal trenches that were built just north of Velika Novosilka, of course overlooking the various roads that are supposed to feed into Velika Novosilka. Right now the Russian forces are establishing a very strong eastern perimeter, which includes having the elevation advantage in many cases that completely dominates the city itself of Velika Novosilka, in addition to the various paved roads that are feeding into it. I suppose the silver lining for the Ukrainians is that you have the Mokryali River, and just west of it, you have this just massive assortment of heights, hills that they have under their control, and a lot of the trenches that you see really marked with this horizontal yellow style, they are on those higher elevated regions. So looking into the future, those regions really are well protected. But to zoom in and look at what's more topical for now, the Russians do continue to advance through open fields, filling the void left by the Ukrainians from, in particular, the 123rd Territorial Defense Brigade being pushed back and really trying to reform, regroup around Andriivka, some of its southern suburbs as well. They're soon going to be really critical in extending and prolonging the fighting south of the city of Andriivka, because the Ukrainians really do have to ensure that the perimeter of the city is under control, that there is enough time for reinforcements to come in to build up some sort of really preliminary defenses, because given the pace of the Russian advances and the amount of vectors through which their attacks are coming, Andriivka will definitely come into the fray within a short period of time. I suppose short in the sense that it's less than the Ukrainians expected, and so they can't really send in large engineering regiments to build these massive defenses, but they could at the very least send in additional forces and really begin to dig in within the city itself. That's something that definitely they're trying to do at the moment, and the Russians are trying to stymie that by continuing their advances, especially over here to the southeast towards Usmanivka. There is a goal that the Russians are working on to capture that village, in addition to all the other settlements running along the Sukhi Yali River. So you can see here geolocation. It's from November 8th of two squads. One was in an APC and one in an infantry fighting vehicle, and they assaulted tree lines around Trudove. Trudove is supposed to be this intermediary village between Bokhoyevlenka and Usmanivka. The Ukrainians could have tried to drag their feet in, but clearly the Russian forces are already continuing with their momentum here and were able to push with rather minimal resistance in this case. So they landed in the tree lines next to this pond, cleared it out, and then they also landed in additional tree lines along this paved road that actually leads to the junction between Trudove and Vesely High. And as a result of these advances and more generally gains over the past week, the Russian forces are getting control over a large chunk of the hill that overlooks the Sukhi Yali River. Much of the hill is now either in a gray zone or under Russian control, or about to be under their control. And that really bodes not well for the Ukrainian reinforcements. Not many of them are actually reinforcements. A lot of them are really the founding stock of the defense over here, like the 79th Aerosol Brigade. They're going to be in a bad position when it comes to elevation. Also, when it comes to their flanks, from the eastern flank, they're being heavily attacked from Katerinivka, Antonivka towards Ilinka and Yelizavetivka. From the north, you have just a large open field region, actually on a hill if you look at the elevation, but not many paved roads over here and not much connection to any other secured locations or logistics hubs, because you go northwards in Kurakhove right now is at the center of fighting. So really the main artery that it's continuing to supply the several hundred Ukrainian men defending over here would be through Uspenivka. And the Russians right now, if you're looking at it, they are about, let's see, about 3 kilometers away. So they're inching their way closer and closer by storming tree lines, in this case with actually a small amount of vehicles because that's all they needed, and then working their way from there and doing so along, in this case, a rather narrow corridor, but that could really prove to be lethal for Uspenivka as the Russians begin to knock on its southern door. Looking a bit to the north at the Krakova front, you can see the Russians beginning to expand their eastern perimeter in lieu of preparations for larger attacks onto the city itself. There's actually a really good thread that I saw today from Playfra, and you can see that I've imported a lot of their trench maps onto my map themselves. So, of course, a huge shout out for that. But they basically go over the structure of the defenses around Kurakhove. A lot of them, their original iteration was in 2015, they were created. There was 2 large fortresses in particular built around the eastern entrance into the city that were built in 2015, and I suppose in the years since expanded, but not necessarily since the war began. And then in 2022, that's when you had a new round of trenches built, especially directly south of Kurakhove, and those ones were less dense. They were less multifaceted in the sense that the perimeter was smaller. There were less coverings, less firing points, less communication trenches, less, I suppose, outlets, you could say. And mainly these trenches were built to be very, very long, or really run along a wide plane horizontally. And then also, in a lot of cases, run through tree lines to provide extra concealment due to the fear of being spotted while they were being built, and more generally during the defensive process. And so you had these like 2 different structures that sort of came together to form what you see today in these yellow lines as the defense of Krakow's perimeter. And even though the 2015 fortresses definitely are strong and they make head-on assaults very difficult, due to the Russians simply having the really large balance and ability, the wherewithal to continue with their assaults over here, it doesn't mean that they will be exhausted for an indefinite period of time. There definitely are abilities the Russians have, and they've proven when they were able to break through in other very, very well defended areas that they could actually sift through, push through even directly with the necessary amount of armored vehicles. And the Russians definitely are capable of taking that loss. They've taken very significant vehicular hits time after time, but it was done with the calculus and understanding that it was possible that they lose that amount, but that it was still necessary in order to dismount some troops that would get really all the way to the line of contact, get all the way to the Ukrainian strong points, and then dismount. And at that point, they would already have their foot in the door, and it would only be a matter of time before taking over those positions completely. And that's something that can only happen with a certain abundance of equipment, an abundance of firepower, so large artillery raining down on those Ukrainian fortified positions day in, day out, in addition to the just constant fab strikes that are coming in and increasing day after day. And of course, an abundance in manpower. You have a lot of these units here, like the 103rd Motor Rifle Regiment, that have recently come in and replaced the 5th Uplot Brigade, because that brigade is operating a bit further to the north, near the Vovchenka and suppose Hirnik areas. So the 5th Motor Rifle Brigade DPR units is no longer really fighting in the Maximilianivka Hostra region. That task has really been delegated to the 103rd, I believe also the 102nd Motor Rifle Regiment. So there's a few units around here involved in that. Of course, when it comes to armored support, you have the 68th Tank Regiment. But these tanks really, they are meant to act not necessarily for dismounting infantry, but to provide fire support for the columns involving the BMPs, the BMDs, and the MTLBs. So those tanks are supposed to either lead the entire charge and then provide just large-scale suppressive fire before leaving. That's usually their task, and so that's what the regiment is really here to do. And then here you have the proof. The 102nd Motorized Rifle Regiment is also involved in these attacks, and so there is the ability to rotate between these units along a relatively narrow corridor. So you can see that as evidenced by the advance amounting to 7.1 almost square kilometers in yellow here. This means that the Russian forces have really gotten control of additional fields directly east of the trenches there that we just discussed. Some of the outskirts of the trenches have already come under Russian control. A lot of them are not fully visible on satellite imagery, but extend to these tree lines over here that are just to the south of Maximilianivka. There are dugouts over here, and they are well-defended positions that Ukrainian troops try to hold on to. But due to the intensity of the Russian assaults, sometimes just coming through columns southwards and creating this flanking maneuver, it made it impossible for the Ukrainians to hold out in their forward positions. So here you have a geolocation. I believe this video is 46th Air Assault Brigade, or some unit that is involved in the defense of the city. And it just shows the Russian column of several vehicles, and they make it all the way to this particular ravine or gully or windbreaks, whatever you want to refer to. It's this low elevated area south of the highway, and they use that as a really route through which to continue their advances, as a clearly paved means by which the Russians could actually enter into Kurakhove. And so you can see in the geolocation how they come under Ukrainian fire. There's, of course, a very strong FPV drone apparatus in this area. And then you have recently the artillery garrison here being beefed up. I would suppose that a lot of those batteries are sort of being organized around the Andriivka area, because Kurakhove used to be just a massive hub for artillery. M777s and such were always being fired from this region into the Donetsk region, into Marinka, into Donetsk city itself. But now a lot of those same batteries probably have been moved over to the Andriivka region. So that's a part of why the Russians are, of course, looking to get rid of that Ukrainian base as well. But really, it is important not to look at Kurakhove in isolation. You have to look at the wider front and the way that it's all converging, which makes it very difficult for the Ukrainians in the long term. And when I say long term, I'm talking about, several months at this point to hold on into the city, because you're looking at the northern flank is really just the Kurakhove or Vovcha Reservoir, whatever you want to refer to it. So there's not a direct connectivity between the Ukrainians in this almost rectangular sort of salient and the ones that are defending in the city of Kurakhove itself. To the south, you don't have that much density besides the trenches that are on the immediate perimeter, but you do have just a large swath of open fields located on hilly area, which the Russians are looking to take over. To the south, you have the cluster of villages that is currently being fought over very, really hardly by the Russians. They are pushing forward with the 57th Brigade here. 36th Brigade is also involved in the operations. 430th, 1472nd Motorized Rifle Regiments involved in the attacks, all converging towards Usmanivka, and that will have the role of putting pressure onto the city's southern flank. So that's going on in tandem with the direct Russian attacks that are coming from the east along the highway or coming from Andriivka, with the intention of overrunning those strongholds and finally getting some sort of foothold within the city itself, which had a pre-war population of 18,000. It's a really well-built city when you look at it, in the sense that there are a lot of industrial facilities. There's a steel plant, grain elevator, power station. Everything's built around here. The rail line runs through here. So really a lot of sites to defend within the city itself. But again, you can't look in isolation, because you're looking at the southern flanks, the eastern flank, and then the northern flank. That's what's the most important in the long term, which could be under a lot of danger. The northern flank specifically, you have to look at what's going on around Sontsivka, because Sontsivka is supposed to be sort of conduit between Andriivka and a lot of contact. And also, I suppose, using Sontsivka, you could also access Kurakhove, and it would be done in an area that's relatively close to the Vovcha River and the reservoir. So right now you have Ukrainian sources reporting on the entrance of Russian forces into the city or town of Sontsivka, but there aren't specifics about their exact location. Definitely, at the very least, the gray zone would indicate that the road between Novodmitrivka and said settlements is currently not under either side's control, as the Russian columns are already beginning to pave their way through here. The objective, of course, is to take over Sontsivka, and from there are several routes that can be taken. First of all, directly advancing southwards along this paved road would spell the end for any sort of Ukrainian resistance occurring to the east in Ilinka or Beretsky or Novo Ilinka. You could see all those trenches here that have been actually well built and are relatively dense, could have been used to protract the fighting. It would all be superfluous if the western flank, the western outlet that is supplying this salient, were to be potentially cut off, forcing the Ukrainians out. So then you'd have, once again, a retreat of several kilometers westwards for a large amount of Ukrainian forces that had just experienced the same thing around Kurakhove and Hirnik. So just continued fatigue for those forces and really losing out on a lot of fields, a lot of territory that could have been used to drag out fighting. So that's, of course, a shame for those forces. And then also going southwards along this highway, you would have the ability to flank Kurakhove from the west. Flanking it from the west would cut off the supply lines to the city, which come directly from Andriivka, come directly through, I suppose, two routes. One is from the city itself, and one is from the suburbs to the south. But both of them actually end up reaching Kurakhove. And a Russian advance coming vertically and cutting off those two routes would make it much more difficult for a very coherent front line, cohesive one that could hold out for a long period of time safely. And so this western flank really has to be looked over, not just for Kurakhove's sake, but also for the suburbs like Shevchenko, Petropavlivka, because then you'd have the Russian opportunity to begin assaulting Andriivka itself from this horizontal eastern direction, in addition to the already very, very, very strong potential of an attack coming from the south, where there is a really open route for the Ukrainians or the Russians to do so due to the lack of strong Ukrainian defensive units operating south of Andriivka or a large amount of defenses being built. I believe the Ukrainians, it should be their impetus now to build a large-scale defensive line west of the Mokriali River and the Solona rivers. You can see how that sort of a line would converge and why it would be necessary for the Ukrainians to do so. The Ukrainians already have a solid base of defense north of Velika Novosilka, which you can see here marked with an X. And here you can see some potential fallback lines to protect really what is the border between Donetsk and Dnipro, because this region currently, which I would say is north of the front line, marked the next, the area where we always talk about the advances in Maksimivka, for example, that region is severely compromised, irrespective of what happens in Andriivka. Besides that fact, you just have these large swaths of open fields with a complete lack of Ukrainian defensive depth or any sort of engineering elements that built up defenses here. And those regions, they're just perfect and very conducive for Russian armored assaults that could run through dismounted forces, and then they set their foot in a certain area and it can't be dislodged at that point. The Ukrainians have displayed a lack of active defense in this region, whereas in areas like Toretsk or in Chasiv Yar, they have proven that they have the ability to conduct localized counterattacks and really stall the fighting. Even in Pokrovsk, they were able to do it to a certain extent. In this Kurakhove and Andriivka part of the front line, there's still not been an indication of that. So it's absolutely necessary for the Ukrainians to at the very least run a defense line from Velika Novosilka to Komar, and then also run it along the border between Dnipro and Donetsk. If that's not possible, then at the very least on the western bank of the Solona River, which runs through Novopavlivka over here, that region absolutely has to be built up, because at the moment there is just a lack of a really connected line running along the entire western bank of that river. So that's something that has to be necessary for the long-term health of the front line. And beyond really Donetsk, which the Russians already claim to have annexed, not to give them any sort of opportunity to do so with Dnipro as well. And really on this topic, the Ukrainians have actually completed building defenses running along this vertical highway connecting Slovyanka to Mezhova. So that is an important step in building up the border defenses, which you can already see in yellow are really in the process of being set up. But these are, again, 30 kilometers away from the front line. It's not going to assist with what's going on at the moment with Pokrovsk. And seeing the way that developments are going on north of Andriivka, this will give the Russians an amazing opportunity, really, to get control of a southern flank marked here with this red rectangle that could put enormous pressure and strain onto Pokrovsk from an area where the Ukrainians did not invest enough resources into creating a solid line of defense. Before we get to that, I want to zoom in and look at additional reports of Russian advances. In this case, the Russians, we know they already got control over Novo-Oleksandriivka. You then also have reports of pushes towards Zoria and more generally westwards towards Yurivka, Pustinka. There was a large amount of open fields over here, which may be in the gray zone at this point that I'm not fully displaying on my map. Also, apparently, according to Russian sources, there are attacks coming directly along the rail line towards Petrivka. Also, in the region north of Novo-Oleksivka, there is a Russian advance in the direction of Pushtinka and Petrivka. So this is a part of a wide-scale Russian effort to undermine the potential fallback line west of Selidove, which was supposed to basically connect together all these small settlements, turn them into fortresses that could be fought over for long periods of time, and then sort of isolate the fighting into those very small sections instead of broadening it out and allowing the Russians to advance along a broad front and along broad open fields. But even directly through the settlements, the Russians are proving that they can storm them and take them over in a quick amount of time. Just northwest of Selidova, the Russians got control of a couple of days ago, 1.5 square kilometers of territory, and this is actually along relatively close to the E50 highway. The E50 highway, which, if you recall, runs directly into Pokrovsk itself. The Ukrainians essentially have three lines of defense that remain intact in this Pokrovsk region. You have the outer one, which is the one that is currently dividing the Russians and Ukrainians, their lines of contact, and it's one that's proven to be successful, in part due to natural barriers, due to local hills that the Ukrainians are able to fall back to, due to settlements that are allowing them to drag out the fighting, like Chasiv Yar, Lisivka, Hordivka, for instance. There's a lot of examples. And then also just because the Russian priorities were elsewhere. The Russians, they invested most of their attacks in the Kurakhove, Selidova direction, not necessarily in this area, whereas the Ukrainians sent in the 93rd Mechanized Brigade to help stabilize the situation, which they were able to do. Also, an important thing to note is that the 93rd Brigade and the 425th Skala Battalion, they were able to get control over the local mine over here and the rail line axis, which could have been used potentially by the Russians to advance along a very narrow corridor northwards and break through the front line, break through the trenches, and make it to the outer perimeter of Pokrovsk itself. That was a really big fear in relation to this rail line, but the Ukrainians were willing to invest the men and resources, even if it did lead to additional losses, in order to prevent the Russians from getting control and capitalizing upon this specific route. And then actually you could see here a Russian drone fixing a Krasnopol strike onto a Ukrainian armored vehicle that was parked in this same salient near a windbreak of the rail line. So that's indicative of the Ukrainian efforts to hold on in that particular region. You have the other line of defense, the second to last one, which sort of protects the eastern outskirts of Myrnihad. And then the third one is built around the perimeter of Pokrovsk itself. To the south, there's just less density, and there hasn't been that much work done to build up additional static fortresses, static trenches, anti-tank ditches, whatever it may be, landmines in this area, this really important area, which is now completely open if you look at the map. Amounting to about 7 kilometers between where the Russians are currently at in Petrivka and the southern outskirts like Novoukrayinka, Shevchenko, etc., south of Pokrovsk. So definitely keep an eye for that. But I would say more importantly, keep an eye for what's really going on around Sontsivka and the Andriivka region. Looking at Chasiv Yar, we have a slight advance. Honestly, it's more than slight in terms of its description because it is 5.2 square kilometers. It's actually a really important advance by the Russians as they are able to take control over the Pivdonia Sikhidny mine. That's what it's called. You can see over here, along with the adjacent quarry. There's a geolocation of Russian drone filming 2 Russian soldiers walking through here unabated. That's an indication that not only has the mine been taken over, but probably also the forested region and trenches east of the Donbass Canal. So now you're seeing really a lot of culmination, a lot of Russian consolidation of positions east of the canal, also spilling into the western side of the canal, taking over really important industrial facilities, local geographic points, which give, I suppose, really good vantage point, really good organization point for future attacks. So this is important in terms of strengthening Russia's flank south of Chasiv Yar, getting control over additional heights. And more generally, the goal now is to expand in the western direction. Of course, there's also the goal of finally expelling the Ukrainians that remain east of the canal, because they really are putting up extremely fierce resistance from the 5th Assault Brigade and several other units that you've seen marked on the map. But of course, there's also the goal of expanding control along this particular rectangle, and from there having a strong base through which to exert pressure on Chasiv Yar from the south, as opposed to just directly doing it from the east. Now moving on to Kursk, we're receiving today and actually also yesterday initial reports of Russians launching attacks, very significant attacks, spanning from the Zeleny Shleich region, but more so northwards in the Pogrebki Orlovka area. So that's a relatively broad front, so we're going to look through all of it essentially. reports of ongoing fighting south of Zeleny Shlaich and in Novo Ivanovka. And in Novo Ivanovka, we actually have a video from the Ukrainian side from the 17th Heavy Mechanized Brigade. So in this video, you have tanks of the units firing onto Russian dugouts in Novo Ivanovka, just confirming that there was a Ukrainian presence in the areas to the east, like Leonidovo and Alexandria, whereas the Russians are dug in within western Novo Ivanovka, trying to maintain control over their deep salient that is east of the highway that connects Kuranovo to Suja when you look at it. So this also indicates the Ukrainians being able to conduct the localized counterattacks in this region, really to push at the axes of the Russian advance that occurred earlier on, like a month ago, and also just to provide some breathing space for the area in between Pogrebki and Leonidovo to ensure that the Ukrainians cannot be cut off or fired upon from either the west or to the east of these flanks, because you do have this really large potential for a cutting off maneuver by the Russians with this salient in the northern parts of the Kursk front. The Ukrainians are completely aware of that, and the best facility by which they can try to, or best faculty by which they can try to prevent any sort of cutting off, is by conducting these localized counterattacks in an area where the Russians do appear to be, to a certain extent, stretched thin, but not a significant amount, as we're going to see, because the Russian forces are actually now beginning to rotate their forces and preparing for large-scale attacks to resume once again. Ukrainians, they claim that they expected this as early as November 5th and that it started around November 7th. They claim that the 137th VDV regiment was replaced by the 51st VDV regiment at the front line near Lyubimovka. Let's actually click on their icon so you guys get an idea of where they are located and how they look like. And they were accompanied by the 83rd VDV Brigade and the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade in their assault actions, which also largely focused on the not necessarily western flank of the Kursk salient, but also the northern part of the front line, because this is an area where you do have a large amount of gray zone, an area that is very, very good for Russian posturing and advances because of the lack of defenses, because of how cut off it is, how far away it is from the main Ukrainian garrison. So this seemed like a logical area to launch attacks from. So that would include the area of Pogrebki, Orlovka, Novaya Sorochina, and as further south as Staraya Sorochina. Those villages were all mentioned in the reporting from both the Russian and Ukrainian side. Russian sources like Rybar, they've claimed that there isn't enough proof to say that there's been a definitive Russian counterattack launched in this area, and that it could be smaller scale attacks. The Ukrainians also responded to in kind with their own localized tit for tats, but we do have to wait for a lot of footage to come out of this, because if there was a large scale attack, then definitely the Ukrainian drone crews were able to get videos of it. And actually, the Ukrainians claim to have repelled some of these assaults coming in from the Pogrebki region, and that it was done by the 225th Assault Battalion and the 80th Air Assault Brigade, these repulsion efforts. So initially, in my second to last video, I discussed how the Russians were able to enter into the northern outskirts of Pogrebki, and that really laid the framework for this most recent advance, which occurred on November 7th. The Russians advanced around 1.8 kilometers southwards, and in the process really did get some sort of operational or just pass through Pogrebki, certain amount of control over that settlement, in addition to Marevka. And they were pictured here in Orlovka. 7 Russian vehicles appear to be abandoned along a road here. This was published by Deep State actually very recently, a couple of minutes ago. And it indicates that over the past 3 days, the Russians have taken advantage of the relatively bad weather, launched large-scale artillery barrages, and launched assaults with their armored columns in very similar fashion to what they did a month ago, basically, with their assaults coming in west from Lyubimovka and Snagost all the way to Novo Ivanovka and even further eastwards. So now you're seeing that sort of being mimicked with the assaults that are currently going on in the Pogrebki region. Currently, the battles are still ongoing according to the Ukrainian side, so they are not being definitive with their marking of which side is in control of which area. So for now, I'm going to leave this sort of like 2 kilometer strip of gray zone until we get a full understanding of the situation. But the Ukrainian sources, some of them, they claim that the 51st Regiment, they use 7 Desert Crosses, and those are, of course, ATVs, 5 BMP-3s, and 2 BMD-2s, in their assault operations. They claim that during the course of the battles, they were able to destroy 2 BMD-2s and 1 BMP-3, in addition to 4 of those BMP-3s being either damaged or abandoned. Apparently, the 83rd VDV Brigade, and this is all according to Ukrainian sources without footage, but certainly we'll talk about the footage if it ever gets released. They say that the 83rd Brigade used BMP-3s and T-80s, and that there was 1 tank destroyed and 1 BMP-3 damaged from that particular unit, along with the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade, which used 14 BTR-80s in the assaults in this same corridor, and that at least 10 of them were damaged, destroyed, or abandoned. So those are specific numbers that are being mentioned, and I hope that there'll be geolocations to confirm that these assaults are going on along this corridor, because it makes sense for the Russians to concentrate their efforts on this one particular area, because if they were able to reach the area of Malaya Luknaya, at that point, any other Ukrainian holdings to the west in these open fields or in these forested areas, these gullies, they would be completely rendered superfluous. There would be no basis by which the Ukrainians could hold on over there, because there would be no way to reconnect to them, and they would have no defensive positions. There's no trenches, there's no basements with houses. It's just large open areas or forested areas. And so going to really the belly of the beast, the heart of the problem when it comes to the reason why the Russians haven't been able to take over these areas yet. In this case, that would be Malaya Luknaya, because that serves as the conduit between Suja, between the border of Sumy and Kursk, and then the actual front line. So we have to really wait and see for additional footage to come out, but that's just some preliminary information. So thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.